It started with a letter Queen Elizabeth never meant for Catherine to find buried beneath layers of velvet in the one place no one dared to look, the throne's inner chamber. When Catherine opened it, she knew nothing in the monarchy would ever be the same. The halls of Windsor Castle had long fallen into an eerie silence after the Queen's passing, but on that night, something pulled Catherine to the chamber. Perhaps it was instinct, or maybe fate, but as she stood alone beneath the towering presence of her late grandmother in Law's private throne, she felt the weight of unspoken secrets pressing down on her. It wasn't until her fingers brushed against a warped wooden edge beneath the cushion that her pulse quickened. There it was, tucked into a narrow slit, wrapped in royal blue ribbon, a sealed envelope bearing the Queen's insignia. The handwriting was unmistakably graceful but worn, like a voice that had weathered too many storms. The date jolted her. It was written 3 months before Elizabeth's death. Why was it hidden here, away from the archives, away from the family? As she carefully unfolded the letter, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. Every word that followed felt like a dagger wrapped in silk. The Queen's tone was uncharacteristically raw, almost fearful. She wrote of betrayal not just from the outside world, but from within her own bloodline. There was no name mentioned, no outright accusation, but the message was crystal clear. Trust had been broken, and the consequences were spiraling beyond her control. Catherine's heart began to race. The letter wasn't long, but each sentence was more unsettling than the last. Elizabeth warned of manipulation, of someone who had wormed their way too close to the throne, someone whose influence had begun to rot the foundations of the monarchy from the inside. "She wasn't who we thought," the final line read, underlined with a shaky hand. That phrase echoed in Catherine's mind like a siren. It wasn't directed at her, but it was a warning, a plea for vigilance. And even though no name was written, the chilling implication pointed towards someone Catherine had already begun to view with quiet suspicion. The room spun slightly as Catherine refolded the paper and pressed it close to her chest. She didn't cry, not yet. She couldn't afford to. Not when this revelation placed her at the center of something far darker than royal politics or family tension. It was something that reeked of betrayal on a scale that could shake the crown itself. Catherine knew that if this letter were discovered by the wrong hands, it would vanish without a trace, just like so many other truths in the royal archives. She didn't speak a word of it to William. Not to staff. Not even to her mother. She simply locked the letter in her private drawer and stared at the ceiling for hours that night, feeling the weight of the Queen's last words sink deep into her soul. Something terrible had happened in the final months of Elizabeth's life. Something no one had spoken of, and now it was up to her to uncover it, thread by thread. But as Catherine dug deeper into the Queen's final months, she uncovered whispers the palace had desperately tried to bury until now. Behind the polished appearances and carefully staged photos, Queen Elizabeth spent her last days in unexpected turmoil, surrounded by shadows, not silence. And Camilla was always nearby. Though the world saw her as the unshakable monarch, stoic, steady, and in control, the truth behind palace walls told a darker story. In the final weeks of her reign, something inside Elizabeth had changed. Insiders now speak of a woman who had grown distant, hollow-eyed, and cautious, even with those she had once trusted implicitly. She wasn't just aging, she was unraveling. A queen who once stood firm through wars, scandals, and betrayals was now shrinking into herself, as though guarding secrets no one could be trusted with. Her voice became quieter, her days shorter, her eyes searching. Palace aides whisper that it all began with a shift in routine, a sudden change that only a few noticed. Camilla began appearing more frequently in the Queen's private wing, far beyond what anyone expected or found appropriate. While Charles claimed it was simply for support, the staff saw something else entirely, a pattern. Every day, like clockwork, Camilla would arrive with tea, charm, and quiet conversation. But after she left, Elizabeth would sit silently for hours, sometimes visibly shaken. Her usually firm demeanor would soften into something unsettling confusion, or worse, fear. One longtime attendant recounted how the Queen would suddenly stop mid-sentence, glance toward the door, and ask in a hushed voice if she had already arrived. Staff didn't need to ask who she was. Camilla's name had begun to carry a weight that even silence couldn't hide. It wasn't just presence, it was pressure. A pressure that seemed to thicken the air every time she entered a room. Then came the outburst. A senior aide, who has since left the palace, claimed he heard what he described as an argument that should never have happened within those walls. Shouts, slamming, and the unmistakable tremble in the Queen's voice when she allegedly yelled, "You've taken too much already," followed by Camilla's steely response, "It's mine now. You said so yourself." The door opened minutes later, and Camilla walked out, composed as ever. The Queen, however, didn't leave her room for the next 2 days. But perhaps the most chilling element of those final weeks was the paperwork. Elizabeth, meticulous to the end, requested numerous changes to private documents, wills, titles, and sealed family instructions. She summoned legal aids multiple times, demanding edits, asking for additions and removals that shocked those present. But when Catherine later tried to cross-reference those documents, some had vanished. Others remained untouched, as if her final wishes had been intercepted and discarded. Whatever the Queen had tried to undo, someone had stopped it. And yet, even with all these pieces falling into place, it wasn't until Catherine spoke to the Queen's most loyal confidant that the full horror began to take shape. She had sworn an oath of silence, but when Catherine came to her with the Queen's letter, the longtime palace confidant broke down, revealing the secret that still haunted her soul. Lady Rosalind had served Queen Elizabeth for over 4 decades. She had watched generations rise and fall, loyalties shift, and history being crafted behind palace doors. But nothing weighed heavier on her conscience than the Queen's final weeks, those private, anguished days when power seemed more like a prison than a privilege. When Catherine arrived at her residence with the letter in hand, Rosalind's hands trembled before she even read a single word. She didn't need to. She already knew what it said, and she had been carrying the burden alone for far too long. Tears filled her eyes as she admitted what no one else dared to whisper. Queen Elizabeth had grown terrified not for herself, but for the monarchy's future. She believed someone was poisoning her legacy, Rosalind confessed, not with venom, but with quiet manipulation. Elizabeth, known for her control and discretion, had started to doubt the very framework she had spent a lifetime upholding, and central to that doubt was Camilla. The Queen had grown increasingly wary of her influence, not just in public perception, but in matters that Charles was supposed to handle alone. Rosalind said Elizabeth suspected Camilla had been gently steering Charles's decisions, whispering at the right moments, reshaping the crown's path from the shadows. But the revelation that left Catherine breathless was one few knew had even been attempted. In the privacy of their final meetings, Elizabeth had made it clear she regretted ever granting Camilla the title of Queen Consort. Rosalind said she tried to reverse it, fought to have it revoked, even drafted a revised proclamation. But the move was blocked. Not publicly, not politically, but internally. Elizabeth had been outmaneuvered in her own house. There were pressures, Rosalind whispered, her voice cracking, pressures even she couldn't fight. It wasn't just about titles, it was about legacy, about the very soul of the monarchy. The Queen had believed Camilla was accelerating a transformation the institution wasn't ready for, one driven by ambition, not duty. In her quietest moments, Elizabeth confessed she no longer recognized the institution she'd led for 70 years. Rosalind clutched Catherine's hand and said something that would haunt her for days. The Queen died with a heart full of doubt. For Catherine, the weight of the truth became suffocating. This wasn't just about a betrayal of tradition. It was about a stolen legacy, manipulated from the inside by someone who had always been one step ahead. But nothing could have prepared Catherine for what she found next. A secret recording, hidden in plain sight. In a drawer sealed with royal insignia, a decades-old recorder held a single voice memo. And it didn't just reveal what Camilla had done, it exposed who she really was. After her confrontation with Lady Rosalind, Catherine knew she couldn't rely solely on second-hand memories and whispered warnings. She needed something definitive, something irrefutable. Though the palace operated on protocol and discretion, even King Charles couldn't deny her the right to access the Queen's private study. Not after she revealed the contents of the letter and Rosalind's confession. Charles, guarded and visibly unsettled, hesitated but ultimately relented. What he didn't know was that Catherine already suspected the real danger wasn't buried in memories. It was stored somewhere tangible, somewhere protected by the Queen herself. Inside the study, time had stood still. Elizabeth's scent lingered in the aged leather of her armchair and the brittle pages of her stacked correspondence. But it was the bottom drawer of the Queen's writing desk, locked and adorned with the royal seal that called to Catherine like an unspoken command. After carefully prying it open with a master key, she found something strange. Not a folder, not a will, but an old voice recorder. Faded, dust-coated, but marked with the words, "Final Thoughts," written in trembling cursive on a folded note inside the pouch. What followed was a sound Catherine would never forget. The frail but composed voice of Queen Elizabeth II, speaking not to the nation or her family, but to herself. It was a message meant for no one, and yet meant for everyone. The Queen didn't hesitate. In the recording, she spoke of betrayal, not of abdication or treason, but of trust eroded over time by a woman she once believed was harmless. She always had a way of bending the room, Elizabeth said, voice brittle with restrained pain. Even before the marriage, she would speak as if the crown were already hers. The Queen recounted how decisions she never approved began appearing in public announcements. How Camilla, under the guise of loyalty, began hosting unofficial meetings, influencing appointments, and subtly guiding Charles toward ideas that seemed foreign to Elizabeth's vision. The Queen admitted she had moments of doubt, only to be told she was misremembering or overreacting. Classic gaslighting, woven with royal etiquette. But then came the words that struck Catherine like a blade. "If you hear this," the Queen said in a fading voice, "it means I failed to stop her." It wasn't fear that filled her voice, it was heartbreak. As though she'd realized too late that the institution she spent her life protecting had been infiltrated from the inside, not by force, but by charm and calculation. Catherine sat frozen, the weight of the monarchy now heavier than ever. There was no more room for speculation. The Queen had seen it coming, had tried to act, and had been silenced. Camilla hadn't simply inherited power. She had positioned herself to take it before the Queen had even departed. Now, all doubt was gone, but Catherine needed proof, and one man held the key, Prince Andrew. Of all people, it was Andrew, once disgraced, who had watched Camilla's rise most closely, and what he confessed to Catherine shattered the royal facade forever. There was no official meeting, no palace-approved arrangement. It was late, discreet, and arranged through intermediaries, Catherine and Andrew, alone at his private estate, far away from the watching eyes of Windsor. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man, the monarchy, had all but erased, now held the very truth the crown could not afford to confront. As he poured a drink with shaky hands, he looked at Catherine with a mix of exhaustion and defiance. "You really want to know what happened to your queen?" he asked. And then, for the first time in years, Prince Andrew told the truth. He began with a chilling admission. Queen Elizabeth had, at one point, considered removing Camilla entirely from the line of succession. It was more than a passing thought. It was a plan quiet, unspoken, and aborted only because Elizabeth feared the backlash. Andrew claimed to have overheard private conversations between the Queen and her advisors, where she questioned whether Camilla had become too powerful, too embedded, too dangerous. But every time the subject came up, it mysteriously disappeared before action could be taken. Someone, somewhere, was pulling strings. That someone, Andrew said, was Camilla. He leaned in and revealed that Camilla had mastered the art of quiet leverage. Over the years, she had collected secrets, conversations, habits, vulnerabilities on everyone who mattered, and used them sparingly, but strategically. Even Charles, Andrew alleged, had become more dependent on her than he realized. She made herself indispensable, he said, by becoming the one person no one could cross without consequence. The most damning part, however, was what happened in Elizabeth's final months. According to Andrew, Camilla didn't just sit back and wait, she acted. With the Queen's health deteriorating, she saw an opportunity and began pushing her own agenda. Royal staff were reassigned. Long-standing appointments were overridden. Even traditional ceremonies were modified under the guise of modernization, but Andrew swore these weren't decisions made by the monarch. By the time anyone noticed, he whispered, Camilla had already filled the room. Catherine sat frozen as the final blow landed. "If you expose this," Andrew warned, "you'll be next. The monarchy doesn't forgive betrayal. And she—" He paused, voice bitter. "She never loses." Then, without another word, he opened a drawer and handed her a thick file. Red markings, confidential letters, correspondence between palace aides and private offices, evidence that Camilla had overridden not just tradition, but the Queen herself. "This will destroy everything," Andrew said quietly, "but it comes at a cost. Use it, and you're no longer safe." Catherine took the file, her fingers trembling, her heart thundering. This wasn't just about loyalty anymore. This was about justice, about legacy, about truth buried too long under layers of deceit. But the moment she stepped outside those walls, something shifted. The air was heavier. Her instincts are sharper. Catherine knew what she had to do, but the palace wouldn't make it easy, and someone was already watching. She had kept it together through scandal, duty, and grief, but this betrayal broke her, and in the privacy of her quarters, Princess Catherine finally let the tears fall. For days, Catherine had held herself like stone, absorbing the weight of Queen Elizabeth's hidden letter, Rosalind's confession, Andrew's explosive file, and most damning of all, the recording that played the Queen's trembling truth into her ears. But even stone erodes. She retreated into the one place left untouched by politics or protocol, her private quarters, away from staff, from scrutiny, from expectation, and there, she listened once more to Elizabeth's voice, raw, sorrowful, defeated. Each word pierced deeper than the last, each pause echoing louder than before. "If you hear this, I've failed to stop her." That final phrase looped like a curse, an admission of loss that Catherine could no longer unhear. She thought of the moments they had shared, private lunches, garden walks, the quiet advice the Queen gave her as she prepared to become future Queen Consort. Elizabeth had trusted her, guided her, even protected her from palace traps, and yet all those memories now felt drenched in shadow, tainted by the knowledge that even in her final days, the Queen had felt powerless. Camilla hadn't simply risen beside Charles. She had climbed over Elizabeth's fading authority, bit by bit, until the crown itself bowed to her will, and no one stopped her. Not Charles, not the staff, not even the family. The weight of that betrayal was unbearable. Catherine collapsed onto the edge of her bed, sobbing into her hands. For the first time in her royal life, she wasn't crying from pressure or fatigue but from heartbreak. This wasn't about titles anymore. It was about dignity, legacy. A queen who had endured everything but had died, knowing her final wishes were erased by someone who had once been nothing more than the other woman. And now, that woman reigned. William found her like that, shoulders trembling, eyes swollen, face buried in her palms. He rushed to her side, startled and shaken. "What happened?" he asked, voice barely audible. Catherine looked up, her voice cracked but unwavering. "She took everything from the Queen," she whispered. "Everything." William sat in silence, stunned, but he knew this wasn't a passing moment. Catherine wasn't merely reacting, she was reaching a threshold. She stood at a crossroads now, caught between silence and truth. Between protecting the palace or tearing down the illusion that held it together. The Queen had died alone in doubt. If Catherine stayed quiet, her memory would fade into fiction. But if she spoke, if she acted, there would be no turning back. And that's when she made her decision. But before she could act, Camilla struck first, and it wasn't subtle. Word had spread that Catherine knew too much. And Camilla, always underestimated, decided to remind the palace who really held power now. In the days following Catherine's emotional collapse, something in the air around the palace shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious at first, but those closest to her began to notice the signs. Invitations to upcoming engagements were quietly rescinded. Events that once relied on Catherine's presence at charity galas, diplomatic luncheons, royal forums were suddenly overbooked or rescheduled. The committees she had helped shape with grace and strategy were being restructured without her input. Trusted aides who once stood at her side were reassigned, removed, or silenced entirely. It didn't take long to realize this was no administrative error. It was a message. Camilla had struck back, and she didn't need to raise her voice to do it. Instead, she wielded influence like a blade, cutting Catherine off from every corner of her royal role, quietly, methodically, and without leaving fingerprints. The press followed, as if on cue. A cryptic headline appeared in a mid-tier tabloid, questioning Catherine's emotional well-being, following a period of increased isolation and erratic behavior. The article didn't cite sources, but insiders knew better. It was a smear planted by someone with reach and motive. Camilla didn't need to destroy Catherine publicly. She only needed to make the world question her stability. Once that seed was planted, it would grow on its own. Behind the scenes, Camilla was even more direct. She allegedly confronted Charles in private and issued a warning draped in regal diplomacy. Catherine was digging up ghosts that should remain buried. She claimed the future queen's behavior was endangering the family's fragile unity, and that if Charles didn't intervene, the damage would be irreversible. The king, caught between a wife rising in aggression and a daughter-in-law sinking in sorrow, said nothing. His silence was louder than any order. To Catherine, it felt like abandonment. When William confronted his father, the conversation quickly turned cold. He demanded answers why his wife was being iced out, why his mother's legacy was being buried under new traditions, and why no one seemed willing to defend the Queen's final voice. But Charles offered nothing, just a tired expression and a vague statement about maintaining stability. William left that meeting with more fire in his chest than ever before. He had expected tension. He hadn't expected betrayal. Then, the final blow came in the form of a note, delivered anonymously, slipped into Catherine's private bookcase, sealed with no name, just 7 words scribbled in a rushed hand. "You're not safe at court anymore." The message wasn't a threat, it was a warning, and it was enough to confirm what Catherine already suspected. The palace wasn't just avoiding the truth anymore, it was preparing for war. With time running out, Catherine made a move no one expected, and it changed everything. Far from the public eye, in the very estate where the Queen spent her final summer, Catherine and Camilla finally faced each other with no press, no staff, no escape. It was Balmoral, where traditions were born and legacies ended, that Catherine chose to make her move. She extended a quiet invitation to Camilla under the pretense of reconciliation, a suggestion of private reflection, something both women could conveniently sell to the public as healing. But behind the elegant phrasing was something far more primal, a reckoning, and Camilla knew it. She accepted the invitation with the same cold poise that had carried her through decades of scandal, knowing full well what awaited her at the royal estate wasn't peace, it was confrontation. The moment they sat down, the air cracked with unspoken history. The civility dissolved fast. Catherine didn't waste time with pleasantries or vague allusions. She opened with the Queen's letter. She referenced Rosalind's confession. She spoke of the voice recording, Elizabeth's words echoing from beyond the grave, and the manipulation that ran through the palace like poison. Her voice, though steady, vibrated with fury. "You used her," Catherine said, each word striking like thunder. "You waited for her to grow weak, and then you made yourself indispensable. You didn't earn this crown, you orchestrated it." Camilla didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. Her response was cold, almost rehearsed. "I did what I had to do for the crown, for Charles, for the future," she said. She hesitated. "I didn't." The words landed like a slap, not just for what they implied, but for what they confirmed that Camilla hadn't stumbled into power. She had pursued it, calculated it. Take it. The tension escalated quickly. Catherine stood, eyes ablaze, and declared the one thing Camilla could never steal: public love. "You may wear the crown, but you'll never have the people's heart," she said. That belonged to the Queen, and to Diana, and now to the truth. Unbeknownst to either woman, they weren't alone. In a quiet hallway just outside the chamber, Princess Anne stood frozen, having arrived early for a planned walk with Catherine. She had heard every word. Anne, the Queen's most loyal child, the keeper of decorum, the embodiment of royal restraint, said nothing. But her silence, and the heavy look she gave Camilla later that evening, carried the weight of judgment more powerful than any proclamation. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with a silence so loud it threatened to swallow the walls of Balmoral itself. Camilla left first, lips pursed, back rigid. Catherine remained seated, breathing slowly, but eyes burning with certainty. She had come not for revenge, but for clarity, and now, everything was clear. But what happened after that meeting would forever change the monarchy's future and public trust. The truth came out, but not from Catherine, not from William, not even from Camilla. It came from a voice long gone, echoing louder than ever: Queen Elizabeth herself. No palace press release prepared the public for what happened next. No spokesperson softened the blow. The voice of the late Queen, frail, determined, heartbreakingly clear, was leaked to a private journalist known for exposing what others feared to touch. The file arrived anonymously, sealed with no royal emblem, but marked with unmistakable gravitas. The journalist, initially skeptical, played the audio once, then again, and then realized the truth would shake the crown to its core. Within hours, the recording was verified by insiders and published across every major platform. The Queen's words, her pain, her regret, her warnings spread like fire through the halls of power and the hearts of her people. "I failed to stop her." That single line, uttered by a monarch known for control and restraint, became a battle cry. The monarchy, once protected by secrecy and centuries of tradition, stood exposed. There was no room for interpretation, no clever spin. This wasn't an opinion, it was the Queen's own voice. Camilla's image, once carefully curated as the stable partner to a future king, crumbled overnight. Public confidence collapsed, approval ratings plummeted. Protests erupted outside palace gates, with placards bearing Elizabeth's final words and Catherine's silhouette beside them. Behind the scenes, Parliament began whispering about precedent. Could succession rules be reviewed? Was it time to examine the unchecked influence within the royal court? Quiet meetings were held in echoing chambers. No one said Camilla's name out loud, but everyone understood the storm had landed. The monarchy could not ignore the leak, yet to acknowledge it would confirm every haunting suspicion. The palace chose its oldest strategy: silence. But this time, silence only confirmed the truth. And then, William spoke. Flanked by Catherine, he stepped onto the world stage not just as a prince, but as a son, a husband, and an heir who would not inherit a broken throne. He did not name names, he did not recount the horrors Catherine had endured, but he looked directly into the cameras and said, "The crown must be a reflection of honor, and when honor is compromised, we must not remain silent." The message was received, felt, and echoed across a nation hungry for integrity. Weeks later, without fanfare or royal announcement, a statue was unveiled in the Queen's private garden. It was not Camilla. It wasn't even Charles. It was Elizabeth regal, serene, but not alone. Her bronze arms were wrapped around a younger figure, Catherine. The symbolism was undeniable. Legacy wasn't just restored, it was reclaimed, not by decree, but by truth. And though the palace may never confirm what really happened, the silence speaks louder than words. Thanks for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.